minimum wage set to go up first of the year. Arizona's got the proposition that passed. Says minimum wage is tied to an index, and as a result, cost of living goes up, so does minimum wage. Not unlike Social Security benefits. Cost of living increases. Nobody says Social Security is going up. That's going to break the system. They go, oh, well, cost of living has gone up. Social Security has to keep up with that. That's normal. And yet when it comes to minimum wage, I can't believe we're doing this. Don't you know what that's going to do to the economy? And it just kind of blows my mind that some people get so worked up when the lowest wage earners get a raise. Now, Steve Goldstein in for Joe today. Steve, you're rich and you hate poor people. Explain why it is.
Wait a second. Let's just remind people who are just listening to us for the first time.
Yeah.
You like to remind people that I worked in public broadcasting.
Yes.
I was there 25 years, Chris.
You got that socialist paycheck.
I mean, I realize the government paid for all that.
All of it.
Not true. But anyway, I know that that's the perception. That does not make me rich, just so you know. Now, the second part about hating poor people, that could be give or take, I suppose. But yeah.
So why do the poors upset you so much? Why?
I'm just going to bring up the fact that we complain so much about why is there no affordable housing in our communities.
Yeah.
But let's not have a minimum wage because we want people to afford even smaller places and even worse neighborhoods.
One of the arguments that I hear is that minimum wage is a training wage and you can't force companies to pay more. That's minimum wage should be a training wage. Anybody that wants more than that, they're barking up the wrong tree. My perception is a little askew now because when I was a kid, and obviously different for you, but I started at $4.25. You were what, $3.75 or something like that. That's when you first did it? Yeah. And now here we are. Arizona's minimum wage is about to be $10 more per hour than what it was when I was growing up, which means it's more than 3 times what it was when I was growing up.
But what's the value of the dollar? That's changed.
Of course, but my perception, and you know how perception works. Like I remember when gas was 99 cents, right? And so we have this sort of reality meets perception issue that goes on with that. So why do you suppose people get so upset when we have conversations about minimum wage?
Isn't it, we talk so much about the different generations, so I don't want to make this a simple answer.
Okay.
But isn't there a lot of it in the same category as get off my lawn, not in my backyard? It's like, wait a second. Yeah. When I was that particular age, they didn't have that for me. So why should these people who are no better than I am making $15 an hour, so whether the dollar went up or not, I was lucky if they paid me anything. I was going to school. I'd go uphill both ways. I mean, it's this whole thing, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it almost sounds like it to me. To simplify it, it's, okay, that's part one. Part two is that sounds socialist to me because you're telling businesses in our capitalistic system what they have to pay people, and you shouldn't be able to do this. It should be market driven. Well, who's driving the market though? So what if, as again during the pandemic, you lose a lot of employees? Okay, well, could you have kept those employees if you paid them $18 an hour, for example? Maybe not, maybe some. Yeah. But so basically you're saying my system is more important than the well-being of this particular individual. Maybe the minimum wage is not perfect, even if it's tied to indices, but there's a starting point there. Mm-hmm. If you're an employer who's doing well and you think this person's doing a great job, you can give them a raise. And the other folks, you can say, you're not good. You want to leave? Great. Or I'll keep paying you the minimum. I'm still trying to fix the dynamic in my head that the minimum wage is somehow a budget buster or a business killer. I just don't think it is.
How many businesses are at the brink of disaster and minimum wage does destroy them? So if I only had to pay my employees $8 an hour, or it was federal minimum wage $7.25, I think, right? Yeah. If I only had to pay my employees $7.25 an hour, I could stay in business. But now I'm on the brink of bankruptcy. I have said something very unpopular when it comes to that, and people don't like it. I go, that means your business isn't doing very well, and you might want to consider something else anyway. And that's from a guy who I grew up, my parents had a business that closed. It just happened, right? Yeah. It wasn't their fault. Sure, they would have loved to have paid people 50 cents an hour instead of paying that whopping $5 or $6 an hour that they were doing at the time. But I mean, that means your business it just isn't viable. People don't like to hear that.
Well, I mean, that is true to some extent, though, especially if you're in a business that isn't employing too many full-time people. Yeah. Because if you think about the difference between 7 and 17, it's a lot if you have hundreds of employees. Yeah. But if you have maybe 10 full-time employees, I mean, how much does that actually add up to? I don't know, but if they're good employees, I think at some point, you have to see the value of human work and say $7.25 an hour. I mean, what is that? That's not, I mean.
It doesn't pay for a Big Mac meal.
And aren't there kids who these days in certain neighborhoods, not my neighborhood, but certain neighborhoods probably get that from the Tooth Fairy now? I mean, I have no idea. With inflation, I have no idea.
They don't believe in the Tooth Fairy in your neighborhood? I love what you said about the older generation, because I think there was a lot of the false equivocation of when I was your age. And that's why I brought that up, because when I was young, it was 4.25. But as you pointed out, accurately so, but it's inflation, ding dong, right? Have things gone up 3 times in the last 30 years? Yeah, probably there. Mm-hmm. Here's a stat that I thought was a little bit interesting in that same vein. Steve Goldstein in for Joe today, as we talk about minimum wage going up here in the first of the year because Arizona's got their minimum wage tied to an index. I believe this was from Axios. Meanwhile, costs have been rising faster than young Americans' incomes, not only for education, but also for childcare, healthcare, and most pressingly, shelter. The Treasury notes that 61% of men have not graduated from college, and their earnings have been declining in real terms for 30 years. And I thought back 30 years. That puts us back in 1994. I was 16 years old at the time, which means I had just entered the workforce. It's when I was making $4.25 an hour. Just entered the workforce, worked 2 jobs. One at a local restaurant, the other I worked at McDonald's. And I would get done with McDonald's and I'd go to the other restaurant because those were the jobs I could get at minimum wage. And I busted my tail for a summer in 94. I'll never forget it. I remember being exhausted and smelling like fryer grease at the end of the day. But since that moment, we've seen a decline in earnings, real terms. No wonder boomers don't see the problem. No wonder the older generations don't see the problem, because they were the last generation to see things improve, right? Because the moment I went into the workforce, if you want, you can blame me. The moment I entered the workforce, suddenly we started seeing a decline in earnings in real terms, meaning that wages haven't kept up with shelter, education, healthcare costs, these other big pillars of expenses in our lifetimes. Sure, a gallon of milk maybe hasn't gone up quite as much. Maybe eggs, aside from this year, haven't gone up quite as much. But by God, have you looked at the price of college? Have you looked at the price of healthcare? Have you looked at the price of housing?
Well, I especially think about this place. I mean, housing has been the focus for a long time, how affordable this place has been.
Yeah.
And let's look at how unaffordable we are now. And, see, there's the fact that the minimum wage is going up here makes even more sense to me, because if you are at the $725 level, I mean, how many roommates do you have to even pay the rent for a couple of months?
Oh my gosh, you can't. And our minimum wage, by the way, will go to $14.70 an hour. It will be at $14.70. At the first of the year. And I honestly don't know how many people are still working for minimum wage. I think it's actually a pretty small number statewide. I
would love the concept to be able to have a system that is truly free market, but you can't trust people and you can't trust the systems. You just can't.
I don't disagree.
Thanks for watching The Chris and Joe Show. Click to see more from Chris and Joe and tap the button in the middle to subscribe to KTAR News.